Evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us in another edition of our Safer at Home series talks. I'm glad to have you with us. The humidity is picking up. I think summer is making a reappearance on the Cape. So here we go again with the more heat and humidity. Before we get started, a couple of things. As you know, all our talks are brought to us by sponsorship of Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. All the books on our tour are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller and Falmouth. We hope that you visit the local and help the economy. Our guest tonight, Louis Menand, was actually, it's kind of nice to have someone from who's in Massachusetts. So if it's under quote unquote normal circumstances, I would have had him down on the Cape, but it's safer this way. So he's in Cambridge. Louis Menand is a professor of English at Harvard. He's contributed to the New Yorker. He was a Pulitzer Prize winner in 2002 for history, and Francis Parkman Prize winner for American historians. In 2016, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Obama. Would you welcome our guest tonight, Louis Menand?
Hi. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming virtually. I wish I could be there too, but happy to be able to maybe get more people listening in doing it this way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, and it's on the Cold War, explain what I was trying to do and how I tried to do it, because it's a little unorthodox in terms of structure. And then I would love to have a conversation with you, questions. I don't know, Mike, whether you've set up chat for questions or you just want to call on people, but when we get to that point, please feel free to ask me.
And we usually do it by chat, so that
okay. So if you'll monitor the chat for me, that would be great while I talk. And then and as I say, I don't know how long I'll talk, maybe 20 minutes or so, and then let's chat. I find that the Cold War is a subject that people have opinions about. And I'm happy to talk to you about that. So the book is called The Free World. The subtitle is Art and Thought in the Cold War. And it covers the period 1945, the end of the Second World War, to roughly 1965, which is the year the United States gets militarily involved in South Vietnam. Because I find surveys kind of boring, but I did want to give the reader a sense of a change that took place over this 20-year period. When you're flying at 30,000 feet, which is sort of the level at which surveys are written, surveys tend to be rather encyclopedic and cover everything. You can see patterns over the long run that aren't visible on the ground. When you're on the ground, everything is slightly chaotic and you're not sure where it's going to go. So I wanted to capture what it was like to be on the ground. I wanted to give readers a feeling of what it would have been like to be an American painter in 1945, or to be an American poet in 1955, or to be a university student in 1960, by recreating as much as I could, as sort of densely as I could, the circumstances that such a person would have found themselves in order to appreciate and understand better how the figures I write about managed to make a difference, managed to become well-known, sometimes iconic figures in the history of this period. So it has this kind of, it's meant to have this kind of ground up feel to it. But as I say, when you get to the end of the book, the 20-year period that I cover, I want you, the reader, to feel that things have changed, to sense a change, even if you've experienced it at ground level or street level. So that's the methodology, such as it is, of the book. So in order to do that, I think there's sort of three layers to the discussion. One layer is what kind of work these people I write about, and I'll tell you who they are in a second, write about produced. So let's say a painter. What kind of painting did this person make? What was the meaning of the painting? Why did they make it the way they did? The second part that I've tried to include is the biography of the painter. What's the life history of this person who made this work such that that person intersected with a particular historical moment to produce something that meant a lot to other people? Because that's really what cultural history tries to explain. So the first part is conceptual. What's the work about? Second part is biographical. Who's the person who made this thing? And the third part is the social forces that are operating, as it were, on the ground to make possible particular kinds of art, particular kinds of ideas. So rather than talk more abstractly about the project, here's how I did it. I divided up the subject into what I call vertical cross sections. And each chapter is about a different figure, or usually pair of figures, and a particular movement or idea or style in the period. I don't cover everything because I try to do an in-depth treatment of each of these 18 different topics. And they're organized more or less chronologically. So as you read through it, you get a sense of this change happening. But each chapter is discrete. I'm not trying to tie everything together. I'm trying to show what was going on in each of these different areas. What are the areas? Okay, so I start in 1945 with the end of the Second World War. And the figure in the first chapter is George Kennan. George Kennan was, I'm sure many of you know, the American diplomat who formulated what's known as the policy of containment. So of course, we were allies with the Soviets during the Second World War, at least since from 1941 on, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. And there was uncertainty when the war came to an end, what role the Soviet Union would play in world affairs and whether it would be cooperative with the United States or not. And it became clear fairly quickly that Stalin was not going to be cooperative with the United States. And George Kennan was then a foreign service officer stationed in the embassy in Moscow. And in 1946, the State Department asked him to explain what was going on in the Kremlin because they couldn't figure out what Stalin was up to. And George Kennan wrote a document that's called the Long Telegram, which is said to be the longest telegram ever sent in State Department history, about 6,000 words, in which he explained what he thought Stalin was doing, what the policy of the United States should be towards the Soviet Union. This telegram was taken up in Washington, became must-reads among Washington officials. Kennan was called back to Washington, given a job in the government. And in 1947, he produced a document, an article published in Foreign Affairs magazine called Sources of Soviet Conduct, which is kind of a restatement of the Long Telegram. So what's the policy of containment? The policy of containment is keep the Soviets in their box, keep communism in its box. Whatever goes on the other side of the wall, so to speak, whatever goes on in communist countries is not our business. They can violate human rights. You can see the same thing going on in Afghanistan right now. They can do all this bad stuff, but we're not going to be involved with that. What we would be involved with is if the Soviets or communists tried to expand their area of control, then we would resist that, or if they interfered with anything that involved our national interest. But if it doesn't have anything to do with our national interest, it's not our business. Kennan thought we did not therefore need to go to war against the communists. We just needed to keep them contained, and they would of their own inefficiency. So we're seeing the same thing going on right now in Afghanistan because the policy of the American government is very much like the policy of the American government about the Soviets in the 1940s, which is all kinds of bad stuff can go on in Afghanistan. Clearly women are going to be oppressed. There'll be a lot of brutality. There'll be a lot of human rights violations. I mean, stuff that we would find abhorrent. But as long as it doesn't affect our national interests, we're going to stay out, because it's not worth blood and treasure to try to fix what's going on inside another country. So that's part of international relations theory called realism. Realism is the theory in international relations that relations should be guided by a cold calculation of one nation's own interests. If it doesn't involve our interests, it's not our business. So Kennan is the figure in the first chapter, as is a German emigre, Hans Morgenthau. Hans Morgenthau was a professor at the University of Chicago, wrote a book called Politics Among Nations, which articulates this theory of realism, and he and Kennan became friends. So those are the figures in my first chapter. So my second chapter is about George Orwell, because 1984 was surely the most influential book of the early Cold War period. That's the book that most people got their idea about totalitarianism from, a novel, a futuristic novel. Interestingly, Orwell was very influenced in writing that novel by an American writer named James Burnham, who wrote a book called The Managerial Revolution in 1941, in which he predicted a future that's very like the future that Orwell portrays in 1984, a future in which the world will be divided among these big totalitarian states, will be constantly engaged in a Cold War with one another, which is the world of 1984. So I talk about Orwell, interesting character in his own right, his relationship to this American writer, James Burnham. So that's the second chapter. Third chapter is on Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, French existentialism. So Paris was liberated in 1944 in August, about 2 months after D-Day, because the Germans basically abandoned the city. There was no real fight for Paris, but it was liberated. And post-war Paris was a fascinating place for lots of reasons. And there was a strong desire in France, as everywhere in the world after 1945, to have a fresh start. So there was room for a culture hero to, so to speak, walk on stage. And that was Jean-Paul Sartre. He was completely ready to go in 1945. And that's when he introduces existentialism, or his version of existentialism, to France and to the world. And it becomes incredibly popular in the United States, and somewhat less popular in Great Britain, and controversial, but it sort of seeps into everything in the cultural field. And it lasts for maybe 10 years or so. People want to think of themselves as existentialists. Poetry associated with lifestyles, atheism, all this stuff. So Sartre becomes this enormous iconic figure starting in 1945. So I have a chapter on him and his partner, Simone de Beauvoir. It's also important for a later piece of the story, which I'll get to in a minute. So that's the third chapter. Fourth chapter is on Hannah Arendt. So Hannah Arendt was, of course, a German refugee. She had to leave Berlin in 1933 when Hitler comes to power as a Jew. She makes her way to Paris, where there were a lot of Germans who hung out in Paris when Hitler came to power, to be out of Germany. And then when Germany invaded France in 1940, she fled to Marseille and made her way to the United States. She arrived in the United States with $20 or so in her pocket. I can't remember the number, $20, $30. And she didn't know English, and she had no interest in the United States. But she stayed here. And in 1951, she published a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is one of many efforts to analyze totalitarianism, but one of the most influential. Interestingly, her book had a kind of revival in 2016 for obvious reasons. So I talk about Hannah Arendt and her book. And one of the people who was friendly with her and read the manuscript of the book while she was writing and was very enthusiastic about it was the sociologist David Reisman, who published The Lonely Crowd, sort of famous sociological analysis of post-war American life. That was published in 1950. Then I have a chapter on the abstract expressionists, because they're the first major American art movement, and they all sort of come together around 1948 or so. All the major figures in abstract expressionism that we know about sort of reached their mature styles around 1948. So I talk about Jackson Pollock primarily. He's probably the most iconic of that group. And the critic Clement Greenberg, who was an early adopter of or champion of abstract expressionist painting, and particularly of Pollock. So that's an interesting story. And a third party to that story is Pollock's wife, Lee Krasner, who was also an important abstract expressionist painter. Then I have a chapter on Lionel Trilling. Just a second. Hi, I'm sorry. I'm just worried my power is not plugged in properly. Hold on a second. Hi, sorry. I have to get a new charger. My wife's going to bring it down. I don't know what happened. This is not working. I got a few more minutes here. So I talk about the literary critic Lionel Trilling. So Trilling's big book was The Liberal Imagination, which was published in 1950. Of the leading sort of liberal anti-communists of that period, he's the most interesting to me. So I talk about his career and the nature of his, thank you. So, yeah, so it's working now. Sorry about that. The nature of his liberal anti-communism. And I also talk about his most famous student, who incongruously was Allen Ginsberg. And that introduces the subject of the Beat poets. I have a chapter on structural anthropology. This is the chapter nobody wants to talk about, but it's one of my favorites. Structural anthropology was developed because a French exile called Lévi-Strauss, who was an anthropologist, met a Russian exile named Rogom Jakobson, who was a linguist in New York City. So they both had to leave Europe, both Jewish, and they end up in New York at the New School. And Jakobson has a profound influence on Lévi-Strauss, and Lévi-Strauss develops structuralism. Why is that important? So structural anthropology is cultural anthropology. And the basic argument of structural anthropology, like cultural anthropology generally, is that human difference is cultural, not biological. It replaces the dominant form of anthropology in the 19th century, which was physical anthropology, in which racial difference was ascribed to biological difference. So it's very important that anthropology make a cultural turn. Lévi-Strauss is the first one to do this, but has an important influence, because the big phenomenon in this period, in addition to the Cold War, in ways more important than the Cold War, is decolonization. This is the period when all the European colonies become independent states. So that means they're being governed by non-white people for the first time in modern history. Social science that says racial difference is biological is clearly not appropriate for this new world coming into being. Then I have a chapter on John Cage and his collaborators, Merce Cunningham. John Cage, of course, is avant-garde composer. Merce Cunningham was dancer and choreographer. Robert Rauschenberg, the painter, and his partner, Jasper Johns, also a painter. They really represent the American avant-garde in the mid-1950s. And Cage in particular has an enormous influence. Much before I started writing the book, I had no idea what an important figure he was. And I talk about their works, including Cage's most famous piece called The Silent Piece. It was 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And I try to explain what he was up to in that piece. I have a chapter on rock and roll. So of course that emerges in the mid-1950s, and that chapter is mainly about Elvis. He's not the only white singer who takes up rhythm and blues and turns it into rock and roll. But I talk about how he did that, largely accidental, and why it worked. And then I talk about the Beatles, who arrived in the United States in 1964 after imitating American rock and roll, basically covering American songs in their acts in Britain and in Europe. And then they transformed the American music scene. I have a chapter on Isaiah Berlin, who wrote an essay called Two Concepts of Liberty in 1958, which was, an important work of political philosophy to explain, I think, essentially the incompatibility of the ideal of liberty and the idea of equality, which is kind of, in a way, the Cold War ideological struggle. And in the context of Berlin, I talk about the changes in obscenity law, which allowed American publishers to publish books like Tropic of Cancer, Betty Chatterley's Lover, and so on. So that's an important, book publishing story is an important part of the thing. Then I have a chapter on James Baldwin. Baldwin's a fascinating figure, very complicated man. And in particular, he lived for many years in Paris. So when he was young in 1948, he goes to Paris and he stays there for 9 years. And he's present during debates in Paris and discussions about decolonization of French colonies in the Caribbean and in West Africa. And so he's interested in what those debates are about and tries to think about them in relation to race relations in the United States. So when he comes back in 1957 and gets involved in the civil rights movement, he brings a particular perspective to that. I have a chapter on British pop art. So British pop art very much preceded American pop art. British pop art begins around 1952. And I try to explain what the British pop artists were trying to do, which is somewhat different from what the American pop artists try to do about 10 years later. Because the British pop artists, artists like Eduardo Polozzi, Richard Hamilton, critics like Rainer Banham, Lawrence Allowell, these names are probably not that familiar to us today, but important figures in British art. They loved American advertising. So most of their art is based on advertising for American products in American magazines, particularly cars. This is the era of the tail fin. They loved tail fins. They loved the whole consumerist world they loved because Britain was in a phase of austerity. So they saw America as kind of land of plenty. So it's not at all critical of American culture. On the contrary, it's very celebratory of it. That's not quite the same thing as true American pop art. I have a chapter on the English department. So one of the big stories more specifically about it in a second is the expansion of the university. And with the expansion of the university, all these disciplines become bigger and more comprehensive, and they grow in all kinds of interesting directions. And the one I focus on is the English department, because that happens to be my own field, partly. But also it's interesting because the dominant school of criticism in the 50s was the new criticism, which was a particular way of reading poetry primarily, which was hugely influential. I think still is kind of the bedrock of the discipline. And I talk about the origins of the new critics who all came from the South. Were very Southern in their attitudes, very conservative people. I try to explain why it was this particular group had such a profound influence on American universities, which are, very secular and liberal institutions. And in that chapter, I talk about what I call the Anthology Wars, which are competing anthologies of contemporary American poetry. One sort of the new critical approach, more academic, certain kind of poetry, rather traditional kind of poetry, and the other like beat poets, Black Mountain poets, more avant-garde poetry, and the sort of war between these anthologies and the growth of interest in poetry generally. I have a chapter on Andy Warhol, who I think is a fascinating character, and American pop art. I have a chapter on the women's movement, in particular Betty Friedan, who was influenced by Simone de Beauvoir. So Simone de Beauvoir in 1948 published a book called The Second Sex, which was actually widely read in the United States. It was a bestseller here briefly, and was an influence on Betty Friedan's book, Feminine Mystique, published in 1963. And in that chapter, I also talk about Susan Sontek, who's a really important figure in this story because she comes on the scene in the early 1960s. she's quite different from other American critics. She's just way more knowledgeable, way more intellectually sophisticated than most of the critics in the United States. And she writes these essays called Notes on Camp and Against Interpretation in 1964. And they really end up transforming the way Americans think about art. So I talk about her. She's also an interesting, rather paradoxical figure. Then I have a chapter on the Civil Rights Movement, again, talking somewhat about Baldwin, about King, about Thurgood Marshall. Chapter on the movies, and that focuses on Pauline Kael, the movie critic, eventually for the New Yorker, but sort of her pre-New Yorker career. And in particular, the relationship between French cinema and American cinema, which is an incredible story. And that culminates in a discussion of Bonnie and Clyde, the movie that comes out in 1967, so slightly outside the frame of my book, but I talk about it because it's made possible by exchange between American and French cinema that starts around 1946 and goes right up into the early 1960s, that produces the kind of movie that Bonnie and Clyde is, which sets off what's called the Hollywood New Wave after 1967. Everybody, the sort of famous directors, and that's when Pauline Kael becomes movie critic for the New Yorker. And the last chapter, I'm almost done. The last chapter is on Vietnam. As I don't talk about the war, but that's sort of, as I said at the beginning, that's 1965 is the year the United States sends troops, Marines into Vietnam. And eventually there's an enormous, of course, buildup of American troops. It's over 500,000 by 1968. So that's kind of where my story ends, because that changes the scene completely. Everything changes after 1965 in American cultural and intellectual life. So I talk about Vietnam, I talk about the rise of the New Left among college students, focusing on Tom Hayden and his wife Casey Hayden, were founders of the sort of modernized version of Students for a Democratic Society. And then I talk about 1762, and then I talk about the Berkeley's free speech movement, which happens in 1964. And I finally talk about the revelations that really sort of blow up in 1967 about the CIA's role in covertly funding intellectual, artistic, and political organizations. That all blows up because in 1967, a magazine, Ramparts, sort of a slick muckraker, comes up with proof that the CIA was funding an organization called the National Association of College Students, or National Students Association, and nobody knew that. And the students who were in on it were sworn to secrecy. So Ramparts exposes that, and then it unravels this huge tapestry of CIA covert funding that goes back to 1950. And that's a great shock for American intellectuals, particularly. So that's the book. I don't have a conclusion because I want readers to draw their own conclusions about the stories that I've been telling. And in general, I don't approve or disapprove of any of these figures. I find them all completely fascinating. Pollock, Sartre, Baldwin, Freudian, Sontek, Pauline Kael, but I don't try to judge them. I want you to decide what you think about them, you, the reader, because I don't like to be told what to think when I read something. I like to figure it out for myself. So I don't have a conclusion, and I don't try to make any broad generalizations about the period. Jackson Pollock is doing something and Elvis Presley is doing something. Is there some connection between them? Maybe at 30,000 feet you might see something, but on the ground they come out of completely different traditions and different stories. So let me just touch briefly, so thank you for listening to that, Tracy, on the main sort of social forces. I remember I mentioned at the beginning that I try to explain what social forces are operating that make conditions for the possibility of certain kind of painting or certain kind of music or something. So one of them, of course, is the Cold War itself. So when I started writing this, which is a long time ago, I imagined that the Cold War and the CIA would play a very big role in the stories I was telling. And I found, in fact, that they really aren't that important. It's a little surprising to me. But when you look at the Jackson Pollock or John Cage or, Hollywood movies, the Cold War is really not very important. Obviously, it's in the background. People are aware of it. There's some anxiety about the bomb. Cuban Missile Crisis was a very, big traumatic moment, American history. But on the whole, I don't find that people are thinking a lot about the Cold War. There's some exceptions. I think Allen Ginsberg's poem is kind of a political poem. Norman Mailer got very interested in the Cold War in the 1950s. But on the whole, the work people were doing is quite apolitical. And Susan Sontag in particular was completely apolitical. She was all about style. She didn't care about content. That changes after 1965 with Vietnam. But before that, it's very much art for art's sake. People are trying to figure out what is music? Is a silent piece music? What is painting? Is throwing paint on a canvas, dripping paint on a canvas a painting? Is a Coke bottle a painting? That's what people are trying to figure out. So it's quite unpolitical. So that surprised me. But it is there. And of course, it plays a role at various points. The anti-communism has a chilling effect, of course, on ideas, to some extent on avant-garde art, but it's less important than I thought it was going to be. The second thing is demography. So there's two main demographic pieces of the story. And the first one, of course, is that in 1933, when Hitler comes to power, all these Europeans want to get out of Europe, particularly Jews, but not only Jews. For example, surrealist artists, because they're degenerates, have to leave. So they all try to get to the United States. The United States in 1924 adopted an extremely restrictive immigration policy. And so in the 1930s, we admitted very few people. Between 1933 and 1944, which is basically the period of the Third Reich, the United States admitted 530,000 immigrants, 530,000, so about 500,000. Between 1921 and 1930, that's like the decade before, immigration had been 4 million. Between 1901 and 1910, immigration was 9 million. So this is this 15-year period or 11-year period, sorry, immigration. How did people get in? They had to show that they could support themselves. They had to prove that they had something that would allow them to make a living and it would not have to be supported by the state. What happened was that you had to, if you were trying to immigrate from Europe, you had to provide letters from someone in the United States who would vouch for you and offer you a job, as well as proof of your own credibility as somebody who could be employable. So when Claude Lévi-Strauss, for example, comes to the United States in 1940, it's because somebody offers him a position at the New School in New York. So he has a place to go. And he's vouched for by American anthropologists who know his work. Hannah Arendt, all these people had to do that. So it's basically a brain drain because it was like getting into a selective college. You had to apply and only the smartest people got in, Albert Einstein. So the average exile, average refugee, the average Jew could not get into the United States. So even though there are only about 500,000 people who come, they're incredibly important figures in European culture. As I said, most of them had no interest in the United States. They thought the United States was a materialistic, bubblegum chewing, place. It was not a real civilization. But a lot of them did stay here and had a huge influence on American art and thought. So Hans Morgenthau, I talked about some of these people already. They're very important to understanding what Americans were doing in the cultural world. So second thing that's really important in this period, of course, is the economic conditions. So this is a period between 1950 and 1973 of unprecedented world growth. So the annual rate of growth in the world economy between 1950 and 1973 was 4.9%. Can you imagine that? Today, we would go crazy if we had 4.9% growth. That's fantastic. the United States wasn't even a leader in particularly. I think the United States was something like 3% or 3 or 4%. And the United States, of course, was a huge economic power, there's no question about it. But all these countries, France, Italy, Germany, Japan, grew at an enormous rate, as did the Warsaw Pact countries, South American countries, poor countries like Austria and Spain, African countries. This is a worldwide phenomenon. So it's unprecedented that growth be at that level for that long. What the result was that people just felt the pie was constantly expanding because it was expanding. It made possible all kinds of experiments, political experiments, social experiments, artistic experiments, because people felt safe economically in a way that they haven't since 1973. 1973, it all starts to change. And the other feature of the period that's striking is that this is also a period of that unusual wealth between the top earners and the middle class, in fact, the lowest in history. So that there's actually much less difference between what the sort of top 1% are making or the top 10% are making and the next 20 or 30% are making, next quintile is making, than there is today, where there's a huge gap. Forget about the gap between the top earners and the bottom 50%. So this is an unusual period. There's lots of explanations for why that happened. I think a plausible one is that the Depression and the Second World War wiped out a lot of owners of capital, so they had to make it back. So there just wasn't a lot of inherited wealth as there had been up to that point. But anyway, it makes for an unusual economic state of affairs. So when people talk about make America great again, that's the period they're talking about. 4% annual growth and low income gap. We're never going to see that again. But that's what people are nostalgic for. You can understand why. And then finally, and I'll stop and want to hear some of your questions. Finally, what I'm interested in is the growth of the American culture industries. So this is a boom period for all the culture industries. For example, music. So in 1946, the year after the war, 8 million records were sold in the United States. 1951, 6 years later, 186 million records were sold, grossing $200 million. 1955, sales were $227 million. 1956, $331 million. 1959, $603 million. So more people listening to music and buying records. So the music industry grows. That's what makes possible rock and roll. The major labels were not interested in rhythm and blues, which was mainly performed by Black artists. They called it race records or race music. So they didn't record it. So a lot of independent labels rose up to record singles of songs of rhythm and blues, and that's of course became the basis for rock and roll forever in 1956 or so. So music becomes much more important to people in the 1950s and early 1960s than it had been before that. And that's an important period of growth. Book publishing grows similarly. In 1947, receipts from book sales were 464 million. In 1967, they were 2.1 billion. So it's even bigger now. So book publishing expands enormously in this period. Same effect, there's more styles, more things can be published, therefore there's more variety, more diversity in the product because the industry itself is profitable and expanding. Magazines. So magazine circulation in 1936 was about 83 million. That's total circulation of all general interest magazines or non-academic magazines. 83 million in 1955, it's 179 million. So correspondingly, because advertising becomes more profitable in magazines. Universities, there's a huge growth in universities after 1945. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that the government starts funding academic research in science fields. They'd never done that before in 1945. So funding for academic scientists comes from the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, Defense Department, NASA, other government agencies. And that funding comes to universities with what's called cost overhead, a certain amount tacked on for administrative and maintenance costs and so forth, which help expand the pool of money available for all kinds of other activities that go on in higher education. So that's an initial spark, and then it's added to by the passage in 1958 of the National Defense Education Act, which is a response to Sputnik, which pumps all this money also into math, foreign languages, and STEM fields. And that also a tide that lifts a lot of boats. Then between 1960 and 1969, undergraduate enrollment doubled, and the number of doctorate degrees awarded tripled. That's a huge expansion. It all kind of stops around 1970. But so all during this period, there's a growth in the university, and the university sucks up more of the culture because it develops all these programs, creative writing programs and so forth, that brings in activities that were basically non-academic before 1960. That's an important part of the story. And then finally, this last thing I'm going to say is the art world. So when Jackson Pollock was painting, it was around 1948 or so, he starts painting the trip paintings. The art world is very small, and very few galleries show contemporary American painting. So most galleries in New York City showed European painting, and a lot of it just showed old painting, and most people who collected art bought old European painting, old masters, things like that, Impressionists. By the time the pop artists come around in the 1960s, that's changed, and there are many art galleries in New York City that now sell or exhibit for sale contemporary American painting, and that makes it much easier for the pop artists to enter into the art world. So the growth of the art world, which includes not just galleries, but dealers, collectors, museum curators, and art critics who understand what drip paintings are about or what Coke bottle paintings are about, are all important to enable artists to get their product out to the public and have the public understand what it is that they're doing. So that's also something that grows up in this period. So what's my conclusion? My conclusion is that in 1945, the United States was regarded, the government was regarded as a benevolent superpower, which had led the fight against fascism and then had helped to rebuild Western Europe and Japan. But it was not regarded or taken seriously as a civilization, that is the center of culture. That's all reversed. The United States burns through the political capital that it had accumulated in the 1940s in Southeast Asia, and it's regarded now as an imperialist power, which is exactly what we didn't want to be thought of in 1945, but it's aggregated an enormous amount of cultural capital, and it's now become the center of an increasingly global world of art and ideas, which is where it remains today. Everything is global now. Music is global, films are global, even literary fiction is global, art is global, but it all passes through New York, Los Angeles, and Seattle. We distribute it to the world. It goes around the world very fast. You can see this America, this cultural America, coming into being at the end of my book, I hope. Okay, that's my spiel. So we have, I guess, about 15 minutes for questions. I'm going to let Mark call on you or read the chats.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Manan. That was great. You started your book by with the phrase, when I was growing up, the thing you thought was the best good was freedom. And is that pretty much the undercurrent of your book? There's freedom and there's a totalitarian, because you start with Kennan, you go to Orwell. Is that really the driving force of why you focused on, who you focused on was freedom?
Yeah, I do. So I didn't start with that thought. As I wrote the chapters in the order that that's how I wrote them, the order I just went through, it emerged at some point, it dawned on me at some point that everybody's invoking the value of freedom. Everybody. It's invoked by Martin Luther King Jr. It's invoked by George Wallace. It's invoked by John Kennedy. It's invoked by Barry Goldwater. It's invoked by John Cage. It's invoked by everybody. So as I say, I was born in 1952. So when I was growing up, if you asked me as a young punk, what's the most important thing in life? I would have said freedom. so that when I wrote the book, I realized where I got that from, because everybody was talking. That's how everybody talked. I didn't make it up. It wasn't very original at all. So, yeah. So what I found was that was the common theme. It was used by everybody so often that it's basically meaningless. So existentialism is a philosophy of freedom. As I said, Isaiah Berlin's famous essay is about the importance of freedom versus equality. Everybody uses it, and they use it so often and for such different reasons that it's kind of an empty term. We have terms like that today. I'm not going to say what they are, but the terms everybody uses because it sounds right, but it's become almost meaningless because it's used so much. So one of the things I was thinking is once I realized this was actually what was going on together, or make commonality among all these different things, was, well, what do I think freedom is? Because of course, when I was a kid, I thought I knew what it was. I thought I knew what authenticity was. Very important, integrity, that kind of stuff, when you're a kid. Then, you get older, you go to graduate school, you read sociology, and you're like, what does autonomy really mean? So I was trying to figure out, writing the book, if there was a version of freedom in the book that I could agree with. I felt, yeah, that's how I would define it. And I did come up with not a very good version of it, which is what I call driving a car freedom. So one of the things that I felt was that this is actually a Sartrean idea, is that the feeling that you're free is actually not correlated to living in liberal societies. You don't have to have free conditions to feel free. What makes you feel free is that you've freely made a choice. You've chosen for yourself. That's what Sartrean existentialism is all about. Once you've made that choice, you have to live up to it to make it the right choice, but it's your choice. You're not dictated to by circumstances, or what Sartre called the situations. So I think that's true. Like driving a car is a good example of that, because I'm a person, probably a lot of people listening, who feel I'm free when I'm behind the wheel, on the open road, that kind of thing. But actually, there are very few things in life that are more heavily regulated than driving a car. You have to register your car, you have to have insurance, you have to have a driver's license, you have to pay the traffic law, I mean, it's quite strict what you're allowed to do in a car, that you're even allowed to be in a car, but it feels free. So there is a sense that freedom is a feeling that people have, human beings have. It's like a species feeling. We all know the feeling when we feel it. It does, as I said, it's not necessarily because conditions are different. Sometimes you need a liberal society to feel that, but not always. So I was thinking that, for example, right now, in the period I'm writing about, freedom, as I say, is used by everybody, but by and large, it's kind of left-wing or liberal value. And now it's kind of a right-wing slogan. It's more liberty, that kind of thing is more associated with the right. But I think that I'm a liberal, in case you haven't guessed, but you have to respect that when people feel their liberty is, they're being deprived of it, because it's something that gets to the essence of what people feel about themselves. So that's what I gleaned about it. So it's real or not, the feeling is real.
I personally love the panoply of characters that you have, and some of them I forgot about, and some I didn't realize just how important they were. Hannah Arendt, for example.
Yeah.
But I keep coming back that my personal favorite, and there's somebody I read in high school, somebody I read recently, somebody I read in between, is Orwell, and some of these people that you wrote about. Who do you think still resonates today the most, and who may have just been a product of their time, of that 20-year period, that who remains timeless, if you will?
Yeah, I think all the artists and writers do, pretty much. I would say the intellectuals don't. So C. Wright Mills, I didn't mention him, but he's in a chapter. David Reisman, even Hannah Arendt, Isaiah Berlin. I just think they're less relevant, or they seem less important to us today. Jackson Pollock, John Cage, Andy Warhol, Allen Ginsberg. I think they're still, those are just iconic works that they produced. They're still interesting to us. So yeah, I mean, I tried to Elvis Presley and the Beatles. I tried to pick people who were iconic, who kind of transcended their moment. One thing about doing cultural history is you realize that the period in which these very important figures actually produce the work they're important for, that makes them important, is very short. So Pollock did all the drip paintings in 3.5 years, 1947, 1950, he just stopped. And it's an incredible body of work. I mean, it's just the most beautiful paintings, I think, in American painting. But he only could do it for a brief time. Andy Warhol, 64 to 68, he gets shot in 1968. People stopped paying attention to him. There's like a very short period when Elvis Presley is king of rock and roll for 3 years. Then he goes to Germany, then he goes to Hollywood, and he records crappy songs after that. So there's a very short period when they're the Beatles 4 years. There's a very short period, in other words, when they do something that it's like, wow, this is making a difference to a lot of people. And then that product lasts long after they've sort of faded. Those are the people I'm interested in. And as I say, most of those people are the creative people in the book, I think, not the intellectuals.
You also had something in there where I think, if I get it right, about how Europeans, particularly the French, really liked American Westerns, particularly Gary Cooper. I didn't realize how much that translated overseas,
Yeah.
So.
The French, so it's interesting, we're thinking about people like Sartre and Beauvoir in the 30s. They loved American movies. They also loved American fiction. They loved Hemingway, Dos Passos, Faulkner. They were translated into French, those novels, in the 1930s. They're very popular in France. Camus read them. I mean, Beauvoir read them. A lot of French writers were influenced by American fiction. I think they completely misunderstood American fiction. I mean, it's just the way they interpret it is kind of bizarre, but they were very influenced by it. And then they also liked American popular music has always been popular around the world, jazz. What's interesting about it is that in spite of the fact that they like these cultural products, mostly popular culture, is that they're anti-American because they're anti-capitalist. So there's a dislike of America as a capitalist, materialist country, but there's actually a fondness for a lot of American culture. And I think some of that culture influences the philosophy of existentialism.
Question here. McCarthyism had a terrible effect on the arts. Why did it last as long as it did?
Yeah, McCarthyism lasts about 4 years. Joe McCarthy gave his famous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia in 1950, in which he claimed he had a list of, I can't remember how many, certain number of 200 or something communists in the State Department, which he actually didn't have. And there weren't 200 communists in the State Department, at least that he knew of, but he found that people were fascinated by this and he kept repeating it. And then he had this career, which is a lot like Trump's career, in which he just made stuff up. And then when he was called on it, he would make something else up. And that went on for 4 years until people finally managed to silence him. And then I think he dies in 1956. So that period is a period of great political chilling in the United States. And it's preceded by Harry Truman, who in 1947 creates a loyalty oath system for federal employees. With some 4 million federal employees are investigated to see if they're loyal, in which the House Un-American Activities Committee starts investigating Hollywood screenwriters and directors. So it's not just McCarthy, it's anti-communism is everywhere. You look in a magazine like Newsweek from the 1940s, it's just virulently anti-communist. So McCarthy sort of, he's the symbol of that, but his own influence is actually relatively, towards the number of careers he ruins, fairly small compared to all this other stuff. So that has a big chilling effect. The numbers overall are not that huge. In other words, the number of teachers who lost their jobs is pretty small, like 1% or less, but it's chilling. So there are people who didn't lose their jobs, but who felt inhibited by fear of anti-communists coming after them. So the influence on American art is slightly different. So it shows up in 1947 when the State Department decides to send an exhibition of American art abroad. This is an early exercise in post-war cultural diplomacy, which is sort of a big theme of the period, in which the Soviets send the Bolshoi Ballet abroad, we send Louis Armstrong abroad, that's part of how the Cold War was fought, partly. So in 1947, the State Department buys about, I can't remember, like 100 works of American art and puts them into exhibitions and sends them. And the press picks up on these paintings, and none of them is abstract actually, but they're all cubist or grotesque in a way to the average eye. And there's a big fuss about the fact that American taxpayers have been paying for these paintings. And there's an implication that a lot of these painters are communists. So the State Department pulls the exhibitions and they warehouse the works of art and they sell them at basically fire sale rates. Interestingly, a lot of them were bought by Southern universities, like University of Georgia has a lot of them because they cost nothing. So it's like George O'Keeffe, John Marin, Jen Shawn, people like that. So the State Department decided to get out of the business of exhibiting American art abroad because it was unpopular. So it was taken over by the Museum of Modern Art. So most of the exhibitions of American painting that go abroad in the 50s are sent abroad by the Museum of Modern Art, not by the government. So that's a case where anti-communism makes it very difficult for the government to promote certain kinds of American culture. Keep in mind what the purpose of cultural diplomacy was. It was to show, particularly Western Europeans like Jean-Paul Sartre, that America produced serious culture, high culture. So abstract expressionism, advanced modernist writing, that's the kind of stuff that they sent abroad. They wanted to show that we were anti-communist, but we could still produce great works of art. And that charges the atmosphere of the period because suddenly it's very important whether the artwork is good or not. If we're saying, well, you can paint any way you want in America, you can't do that in the Soviet Union, then the work that people are painting has to be good. So there's a big dispute about whether drip painting is actually good painting. If it's not, we shouldn't be showing it off because it just shows we don't know what we're doing. But if it's great painting, which is what Clement Greenberg thought, then we should show it because the Europeans go, wow, Americans really, are real artists. So that's part of what's going on in the period.
Was there a favorite character that you had? Mini bio that you had of all the people that you wrote about? Was there someone that you really leaped to the fore that I really like this guy, or somebody you really didn't like? And was there someone that had to get left on the cutting room floor that you really wanted to include but you couldn't?
There are a lot of topics that I wanted to include. Not so much figures, but one of them is jazz, which I don't talk about, or only very briefly. Obviously, a very important story in the period. Another one is relations between New York art and Japanese art in the 50s and early 60s, which is I talk a little bit about that also, but not enough. And then, I should have something on science, I should have something on economics, but I don't. So as disciplines. So those are things I didn't do. I love all my characters, I have to be honest with you. I love Jack Kerouac. I think he's, I just think he's fabulous. I love Andy Warhol. I mean, not everybody does, but I do. Not really. As I say, I found Baldwin kind of a slippery character, complicated character, I shouldn't say slippery, not in a bad sense, but very unpredictable. It's really hard to figure him out so often. But I felt I got to know him, and I felt I empathized what he was trying to do. He was very loyal to American blacks. He felt they understood the black experience, whites did not understand it. Susan Sontek they're all interesting. They're all great. Yeah.
You had said before we got started that you're going on sabbatical this year from Harvard, but you you mentioned that you're kicking around an idea for your next book. What might that be, or are you at liberty to say?
No, Vietnam. I have to write a book about Vietnam. I mean, that's where I am my book, and then on the premise that everything changes after 1965 when we get involved in the war. So I thought I should explain what happened. So it would just be about that brief 8-year period. So we entered 1965, and then we withdraw in 1973, and then the war ends in 1975. So it's just about those 8 years, because particularly the first 5 of those years until Cambodia, the country was in a fever about Vietnam. That's all anybody thought about, argued about, talked about. And I think it had a big effect on American culture and American life. So that's the next book, but it's not, this book is 750 pages. That's not going to be that long, because I won't live long enough to write it. But, yeah.
Well, with that, there's also a question too, that you start your book, talking about Kennan and containment. Did I guess we segue into Vietnam here. Did that long telegram influence the Dulles brothers, and is that what impacted Vietnam strategy?
Yeah. So what happens is that in 1966, Kennan is called before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and they ask him, "Is this what you meant by containment, that we have to send troops to keep North Vietnam from crossing the 17th parallel?" And he can't really answer that question, because it's one thing to say, "Oh, they sent the Bolshoi ballet out, we'll send Louis Armstrong out," but you can't send Louis Armstrong to Vietnam. It's not going to stop. It's not going to help. So the United States found itself in a situation where the doctrine of containment basically mandated that whatever form communist aggression took, we had to resist it. If the form was military, that's the only way you can resist it. But Kennan didn't care about Southeast Asia. He was thinking about, all he cared about was Western Europe. So that was part of it. And part of it was that it's not exactly what he imagined, that we would go to fight all these wars in these liminal areas around the world. But that's kind of what we did in Vietnam. So it ends that way because Vietnam is a crisis of the policy of containment. That's right. So do we have all questions answered? Because I should go at some point.
Well, hold on. All right, we do have all questions. Right? Yeah. Well, I mean, you can stay as long as you want. But we have all questions answered. So I want to thank you for taking the time to doing this tonight. The name of the book is called The Free World. The name is Louis Menand. Thank you for taking the time. I hope you enjoy your sabbatical year.
Thank you.
And good luck with this book, and good luck with your next book. So
thank you, Mark. Yeah. Well, I hope people buy it and enjoy it, because I think it's fun to read.
All right. I would agree with that. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Good luck to you, and thank you for joining us tonight, too. I greatly appreciate this.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody.